We always see this stubborn gap in school achievement between students from different social backgrounds. And our first thought is usually to blame things like poverty or underfunded schools. But what if one of the biggest barriers isn't about resources at all? What if it's something invisible, something happening right inside the classroom? So, yeah, why does this gap just refuse to close? Well, structural factors are definitely part of the story, no doubt. But a really fascinating 2022 working paper looks for a cause that's much, much harder to see. It asks a pretty tough question. What if the problem starts in the mind of the teacher? Okay, so let's dive into this paper. It's called Caste Identity and Teachers' Biased Expectations, and it takes us to Bihar, India. This is a state where social lines drawn by caste are still incredibly prominent. The researchers wanted to find out if a student's caste identity was shaping their teachers' expectations long before any work was even turned in. Now, we already have some research showing that teachers can be biased when they grade papers, but this study, it digs a level deeper. We're not just talking about biased grading here. We're talking about the very formation of biased expectations, the core beliefs a teacher holds about a student's potential from the get-go. So to understand what's going on, you just need to know these two broad categories they used. The paper groups people into what are called forward castes, which is the general category, and backward castes. That second group includes communities that have historically faced a lot of social exclusion, like the other backward classes, or OBC, and the most disadvantaged groups, the scheduled castes and tribes, or SC and ST. And this really gets us to the heart of it. The study isn't just asking, do teachers grade unfairly? It's asking something much more fundamental. Do teachers look at a student, see their caste, and immediately form an inaccurate, biased belief about how smart or capable they are? To answer that question, they needed a lot of data. So the research team went out and surveyed over 1,000 students, 1,088 to be exact, and 229 teachers across 105 different government schools. This gives us a really solid, wide-ranging look at what's actually happening on the ground. So how in the world do you measure a bias that people might not even admit they have? I mean, you can't just ask them, right? Well, the researchers came up with a really clever way to make this invisible bias visible. Their method is both simple and pretty powerful. First, they gave all the students standardized tests. This gave them an objective, fact-based measure of each student's actual academic rank in the class. Second, they went to the teachers and asked them to subjectively rate those same students as being in the top, middle, or bottom third of the class. And third, they just measured the gap between that objective reality and the teacher's subjective perception. And that gap is the key to everything. They gave it a name, evaluation bias. It's basically a number that perfectly captures how far off a teacher's personal belief is from a student's actual proven ability. Now, here's how they made their findings so rock solid. They used a statistical method that allowed them to compare how the very same teacher rated a backward caste student versus a forward caste student, all within the same classroom. This is great because it rules out other explanations, like maybe one teacher is just a tougher grader than another. It zooms right in on the bias itself. All right, so they set up this brilliant experiment to measure the invisible. Now we get to the core of this whole explainer. What did they actually find? Who is biased and against whom? The stage is set, the data is all collected. After all this incredibly careful work, what did the evidence actually reveal about teacher expectations in Bihar? While the results were striking, I mean really striking, while teachers who came from backward castes showed very little evaluation bias, teachers from forward castes were a completely different story. They systematically and significantly underestimated the performance of backward caste students compared to their forward caste peers. And the size of this bias wasn't small. The study found that forward caste teachers rated their backward caste students anywhere from about 0.2 to 0.4 ranks lower than their actual test scores deserved. Basically, they were seeing these students as less capable than they truly were. Let me put that in terms of probability, because this is wild. A student from a backward caste is up to 27 percentage points more likely to be underestimated if their teacher is from a forward caste. That is a massive, tangible effect, rooted purely in perception. Okay, but this is the key follow-up question, right? You might be thinking, well, could it be that backward caste students taught by forward caste teachers just happened to perform worse? Was this gap real, or was it purely in the teacher's head? The data is crystal clear on this. when you look at the students' actual objective test ranks, there was no statistically significant difference in performance. So no, the effect wasn't coming from the students' test papers. The students were performing just as well, no matter their teacher's caste. And this is what really illustrates the problem. The entire effect shows up in the teacher's subjective readings. You see those little asterisks? That means the result is statistically significant. It's proof that the gap wasn't driven by student performance. It was driven entirely by the teacher's biased perceptions. And if you dig just one layer deeper, it reveals an even more sobering detail. This bias wasn't spread out evenly. It was most severe against the most marginalized students, those from scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, specifically when they were being evaluated by teachers from the general or forward caste category. Okay, so we've seen the evidence of these biased expectations, but why does this matter so much? Let's talk about the real-world impact and the long-term consequences of these invisible beliefs. Well, this finding plugs directly into a famous psychological idea called the Pygmalion effect. It's this concept that what we expect of other people can actually become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If a teacher expects less from a student, they might, without even realizing it, give them less attention, fewer challenges, and less encouragement. And over time, that student can internalize that lower expectation and actually start to perform worse. The authors of the paper just sum it up perfectly. It's a devastating cycle. This inaccurate belief inside the teacher's head can eventually create the very outcome they expected, robbing a student of their potential, not because of their ability, but because of a biased perception. You know, this study gives us a really stark data-driven look at bias in one specific place. But it kind of forces all of us to look inward, doesn't it? What are the invisible shortcuts and stereotypes that might be shaping our own expectations of the people around us every single day? And maybe more importantly, what can we do to challenge them?